Welcome back, everyone. I'd like to start by giving a little bit of context on this roundtable. As many of you know, Jim Cummins' plenary echoes the theme of our previous CERBAL conference, which took place in 2018. That conference was entitled Translanguaging Challenges and Opportunities. And I think this echo from the previous conference shows us how relevant the topic continues to be today. And when I first saw Jim's abstract for his plenary to this conference, I thought that perhaps we can go even further and have a roundtable right after it. So in a way, this roundtable is a bit of an afterthought in our programming. Jim responded very positively to the roundtable idea. Thank you very much, Jim. And the panelists were extremely kind to accept such a last-minute invitation. I'm very excited that this has come together, and I thank you all for that. As I started to prepare, I reflected on how the conversation on translanguaging has evolved, and I realized that it has been at times polarized in some ways. When we think of polarization in broader society, often we think of politics and some of the extreme events that it can bring about. And there are many recent examples of extreme polarization around the world, of course. But in academia, polarization is perhaps not necessarily a bad thing. I wonder if it can be useful because it can help us articulate our positions and allow us to be passionate about the critical beliefs that we may hold. So in this sense, polarity should be fine as long as discourses of polarity are also supplemented by discourses of plurality. Plurality can sometimes help us see common ground, and plurality can offer researchers, teaching practitioners, and policymakers various diverse perspectives that they can evaluate critically and decide which one they want to align themselves with. Perhaps even drawing on strands from multiple perspectives can help stakeholders arrive at new ones. So this is some of the conceptual framework, or the conceptual work, I should say, rather, that went into the planning of this roundtable. And we have a panel of speakers who will offer us a range of diverse perspectives. They are Angel Lin from Simon Fraser University, Nelson Flores, University of Pennsylvania, Kate Seltzer, Rowan University, Yasone Cenoz, University of the Basque Country, Dirk Gorger, University of the Basque Country. Some of these speakers may choose to respond directly to Jim's plenary talk, which we just heard, and others may choose to offer us a general statement of their position on translanguaging. The contributions will be strictly capped at 7 minutes for the panelists and 10 minutes for concluding remarks by Jim. I hope we'll get a couple of minutes at the end for questions and informal interactions. Our first speaker will be Angel Lin, who has sent us a pre-recorded statement, which we will play for you now. Enjoy.
Good morning.
There we go.
Thank you for inviting me to be a discussant. I have 7 minutes and I'm pre-recording this to make it within the time limit. It's such a huge topic, and thanks for Professor Jim Cummins and the other panelists. I just would like to offer 3 slides in 7 minutes. I want to say there are different theoretical lenses or narratives. Theories are just stories, but there are stories which are more attuned to our observations, our empirical observations, and there's not one single theory which works. So I'm all for having multiple theories and multiple theoretical stories for different purposes. So one narrative, one theoretical story or theoretical lens is a boundical view of language and language learning with solid boundaries of a linguistic system. So your first language, L1, and then you learn L2, the second bounded system, separate system, and then L3 and L4. And they are more or less discrete, bounded, static, rule-based system. And then there is another theoretical lens or theoretical perspective, which is a dynamic view of languaging. focusing on the process of languaging, meaning the process of communicating. So it's focused on the dynamic fluid processes, and it is non-binary, and it focused on feature-based chunking and clustering. I try my best to visualize it with this diagram. Is necessarily a reduction of what's actually transpiring. So of course there are patterning, there are structures, which more or less fluid, depending on how much external and internal self-policing and other policing. So in different situations, you will find, yeah, in an exam, in a job interview, where you have very solid expectations that you stick to the boundaries of these patterns, meaning don't deviate, don't cluster different features together. And then there are also situations where there is less self-policing, less other policing, and expectations, or you can mix and match with different features. Actually, I prefer the term transfeaturing. And this feature can be lexical feature, grammatical sentence grammar feature, sentence pattern feature, or stylistic feature, genre feature, phonological feature. So these features, they don't have solid boundaries. They are more like this diagram. That is, they cluster, they chunk. And in context where there's less self-policing and other policing, when the conventional expectations allows you to draw on all these features to do your languaging, to do your communicating. So it's more focused on the first order, immediate, moment-to-moment, dynamic communicating process. Whereas you can, of course, step back and make a sentence grammar, make a lexical grammar, make genre grammar, you can make all kinds of more stabilized descriptions, which you can call grammars, which you can call patterns, which you can call structures, linguistic structures, and use it for your purpose of teaching, use it for your purpose of identity struggles, that this is my language, this is my language grammar, this is this boundary of my language, when especially for minoritized groups, when you want to assert your identity by setting up a discrete boundary and say, this is my language. So I see utility in using different theoretical lenses. And I'm all for multiple theoretical perspectives for different purposes. But I have to say that the bounded view does lend itself more easily to colonial hierarchies. That is one of the easy thing to do by the authorities, be it colonial, be it dominant socio-political elite groups of people, is to put a boundary around this linguistic system and that system, and then set a hierarchy. This is language A, language B, language C, or academic language and everyday language, or academic registers, everyday registers, and then put them into boxes and then set them up into a hierarchy and then set up this rank order. And I would say the coded view does lend itself, this theory does lend itself more easily to that kind of colonial or manipulation in terms of setting up language ideologies. That language A is beautiful, language B is a dialect, is not a language at all. So that kind of ideological discourses. I think I have exhausted my 7 minutes. I just want to say I am all for first order languaging, heterogenic, heteroglossic dynamic languaging, and then seeing all the other second order, third order entities as You step back, and then you have this static descriptions of what's happening. I hope this makes sense to you. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Thank you so much, Angel. Excellent timing. Our next speaker that I would like to invite is Nelson Flores. Nelson, I'll give you a reminder after 6 minutes. Please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So I have a lot to say in a little bit of time, so I'm going to be speaking quickly. So I think my disagreement with Dr. Cummins stems from the fact that we're using different theories of language. For Cummins, language is a set of disembodied features that exist as separate from the people who use them, and that this can be objectively documented by researchers. I reject this premise and instead believe that language is embodied in ways such that the social status of the speaker can impact how their language practices are taken up by the listener, which could include researchers. In my research, I focus specifically on examining both historical and contemporary examples of the role of race in shaping hegemonic perceptions of language, which Jonathan Rosa and I have termed the white listening subject. For example, white settler colonialists described indigenous languages as products of, quote, savage minds that were at an earlier stage of human development than Europeans. In our contemporary context, I recently heard a teacher suggest that her Latinx students lack the ability to engage in inferencing because they lacked academic language. Inferencing, of course, is literally something everyone can do, and yet the representations of the students' language practices as non-academic led this teacher to conclude that these students were unable to do this. Perhaps, one might speculate, because of their, quote, savage minds. I don't think that the similarity between these two ideological representations of language are purely coincidental, nor did I just theorize them in the ivory tower. These are ideologies I see in classrooms all the time. In the spirit of Cummins suggesting that we use a classroom reality test to see how these theories are doing, I would say that my many years first as a classroom teacher and now a researcher and now a teacher educator, the academic language as a concept is failing in the promote racial equity part of the test. Despite Cummins' claims to the contrary, I have written extensively on the role of representations of researchers in producing deficit perspectives in the work that gets taken up by teachers. While Cummins claims that the concept of academic language says nothing about middle class and lower class students, I have shown in my work the concept of academic language has its roots in the culture of poverty theory, popularized in the 1960s as an alternative to eugenics that argued that multiple generations of poverty produced cultural and linguistic pathologies in racialized communities that needed to be remediated. It was within this framework of the culture of poverty that Cummins first introduced the concept of semilingualism to describe racialized bilingual students who purportedly lacked native-like proficiency in any language. Putting aside critiques of the very idea of a native speaker, the concept of semilingualism argued that something about the language practices of racialized bilingual students excluded them from what was understood to be a normative human, namely being a native speaker of at least one language. This was not an objective description, but rather an ideological one that suggested that racialized bilingual students needed to receive remediation to become normative humans who are native speakers of a language because of perhaps their, quote, savage minds. Now, it might be that Cummins still subscribes to the culture of poverty theory that provided the ideological foundations of semilingualism and see this as an objective description of the world. If so, I would say that that's a fundamental disagreement that we have, as I believe all communities have complex cultural and linguistic practices. By starting with an ideologically constructed lack, the culture of poverty theory can only lead to deficit frameworks. You cannot affirm cultural and linguistic practices that you believe are lacking and need to be fixed. And you cannot decolonize a framework that is colonial at its core. You need an entirely new framework. Perhaps Cummins now rejects the culture of poverty theory. If this is the case, my question is, what is now suddenly objective about the concept with roots in the culture of poverty theory? Indeed, as Cummins himself acknowledged, its roots of academic language are in assessments, which was also the case with the construction of semilingualism. What now makes assessments that used to designate racialized bilingual students as semilingual as now lacking academic language objective? While Cummins suggests that this has nothing to do with race or class, in my many years in classrooms, I've never heard middle-class white children struggling on standardized assessments be described as lacking academic language. This designation is strictly reserved for low-income students of color. Based on the ways that it's deployed in actual classrooms, my concern is that the conceptualization of academic language continues to universalize the white listening subject in ways that discount local knowledge and perceptions of racialized communities. My concern with discussions of additive bilingualism, it doesn't account for the role of the white listening subject in shaping the perception of the language practices of racialized communities. It doesn't account for the fact that since the dawn of European colonialism, white colonialists have proposed their ideological perceptions of language onto racialized communities as if they were objective descriptions of the world. Cummins says that what he refers to as UTT supports the idea of racial-linguistic ideologies. How does it do this? How does it account for the role of the white listening subject in the production of assessments that are instrumental in the construction of these supposedly objective descriptions, themselves with direct roots in eugenics? A theory that purports to accept the racial-linguistic ideologies must at the very minimum have answers to these questions. Translanguaging, as I interpret it, offers a different view. Specifically, it grapples with the ideological dimensions of all representations of language, and as a framework consciously chooses to position itself in ways that frame racialized bilingualism as the norm. Unlike Cummins, I believe this isn't just a theoretical point, but one with profound practical implications, one that has allowed me to change my perspective over the years. The rejection of bounded notion of language as colonial construct led me to the recognition of the inherent heterogeneity of all language practices, including those perceived as standard and academic. This heterogeneous view of language focused my attention on the contrast between the racial-linguistic policing of linguistic features used by students in low-income racialized communities that were deemed non-academic by their teachers, and their relative unmarkedness in elite academic spaces. It also eventually led me to the development of a non-dichotomous view of language that I have termed language architecture. Despite dominant representations to the contrary, language architecture takes as its point of entry the assumption that racialized students already engage in the types of complex language practices desired in school, but that their knowledge is being misrecognized because of the pervasiveness of racial-linguistic ideologies. Using this as a point of entry allows for new pedagogical practices to emerge, one that adopts a language exploration rather than a language policing model, and one that places the existing rhetorical sensibility of racialized students at the center of instruction, and focus on supporting them in developing their own unique voice and style, rather than the mastery of so-called academic language.
1 minute remaining.
So perhaps we should put academic language in its place as having direct roots in assessment data produced within the logic of the culture of poverty theory and more distant roots in logics of colonialism. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that teachers or researchers who promote the idea of academic language are necessarily racist. Instead, my point is that the discourses that we use have histories, and it's important for us to be aware of these histories when we mobilize them. In the case of academic language, the logic that undergirds it connects to a broader colonial history that was used to construct and maintain racial hierarchies. Therefore, for me, the more productive conversation is not whether translanguaging is unitary or cross-linguistic, or who isn't using academic language, a question that I believe is more in the perceptions of the listener than the practices of the speaker, but rather how to develop truly decolonial logics that position the knowledge, perceptions, and practices of racialized communities at the center of our understanding of language and how to incorporate language into our pedagogies and life. It is this conversation that translanguaging and a racial linguistic perspective had led me to, and one that I welcome others to join me in continuing.
Thank you kindly, Nelson. Our next speaker is Kate Seltzer from Rowan University. Kate, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Really happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. What I'm going to talk about really builds on Nelson's powerful historicizing of some of the concepts that lie beneath Jim's critique of translanguaging and racial-linguistic ideologies. And Nelson included some examples of how deficit framings have portrayed students, for example, as lacking the everyday thinking practices like making inferences. And I could add many more examples to this example. But in my own work with teachers, I can say that it doesn't have to be this way. There are ways of both empowering teachers to question and disrupt monoglossic racial-linguistic ideologies and equipping them with tools to create meaningful, effective language and literacy instruction. So I want to begin by sharing a classroom reality that comes from my research with an English language arts teacher in New York City. This teacher, Ms. Winter, teaches in a school where some of the classic deficit narratives and framings of students are most common, right? The school serves students who come from quote unquote low socioeconomic backgrounds. The test scores and attendance rates of the students in this school can be very low. Many students have or have had some kind of label placed on them: English language learner, long-term English learner, special education student. And Ms. Winter is tasked with preparing these students for a high stakes standardized exam that's necessary for these students to graduate. This is a language and literacy assessment that all students in New York State have to take if they want to graduate from high school. And as has been documented by Kate Mencken and others, it is particularly difficult for students labeled English language learners to pass this test. But rather than typical approaches to preparing students for this test, which are so often rote, remedial instructions, instruction that teaches to the test, Ms. Winter teaches with the perspective that these students, and her students are both bilingual students and racialized English-speaking students, are already engaged in going far beyond the kind of language and literacy practices that expected of them on this test. So she designs instructional opportunities for students to explore their own language and literacy practices, to read the work of writers who engage in translanguaging, to write in ways that both challenge existing language norms and in ways that align with those norms, right? Like in the style of the test. And as they engage in this exciting ELA class, as they talk about language itself, what also comes up are their experiences, students' experiences as language minoritized people. They talk about linguistic prejudice, about times they sensed their language practices were being judged, about interactions with authority figures like teachers, like police, where their ways of languaging were linked with being threatening or disruptive or insubordinate. And the teacher, Ms. Winter, she listened. She, a white English-speaking woman, learned from them. And she shifted her instruction so that students' experiences and sophisticated understandings of the links between language, identity, and power became the curriculum. And the results were really striking. Students wrote incredible, powerful poetry. They acted out provocative role plays. They engaged in deep critical analysis of texts. And they both critiqued and prepared for the standardized exam that they were expected to take, and which in the end, they scored higher on than any other year that Ms. Winter taught 11th grade. So in my work with teachers like Ms. Winter, both as a researcher and as a university teacher educator, I try to invite teachers to walk a line, to teach the language and literacy practices expected of students by schools, and to learn alongside their students about the intersections of language and power. For many teachers, particularly those who are white and monolingual, it means unlearning ideologies about language and its links to racialization and colonization. We talk about the normative communicative practices of bi and multilingual communities, communities that so many teachers I work with have never been a part of in a meaningful way. We talk about how solid, well-scaffolded, culturally sustaining, engaging instruction and curriculum can bring students translanguaging and understandings of language to the surface, and how we as teachers can both question ideas about what counts as quote-unquote academic language and teach students to integrate new practices into their repertoire that as they explore them can become a part of who they are and how they language, or not. Right, to paraphrase what Nelson said in his talk, we give them the opportunity to explore language. We don't police it. So Jim said in his talk that there are no pedagogical differences between these different conceptualizations of translanguaging. But with that, I think I have to disagree. Translanguaging absolutely invites bilingual instructional strategies and ways of leveraging students' language practices for their learning, but it also invites something different. It invites a collaborative disruption of those ideologies that have marginalized language minoritized students in school and beyond. By collectively grappling with questions like is there such a thing as academic language? Or how can language both open and close doors to people? In addition to drawing on all of students' linguistic repertoire and adding new practices to it, teachers have a decolonial, anti-racist framework for educating language minoritized students and an empowering pedagogical approach.
1 minute remaining.
Thank you. That can hone teacher practice and improve students' educational experiences. So I appreciate the time. I really look forward to hearing the rest of the panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kate. Our next speaker, Yasone Cenoz from University of the Basque Country. You have the screen.
Hello. Well, I would like to discuss a couple of things related to Jim Cummins's talk. And first is about the differences, the existence of languages. And I would say that from a more practical, pedagogical point of view, there is a social reality of different languages. And in his words, it's experiential, material, and cognitive reality. I must say, I mean, I speak Basque, Spanish, and English almost, well, every single day. And I know when I'm speaking one language or the other, but it is also true that there are some cases, usually informal, when it's a kind of using elements from the whole linguistic repertoire because of the characteristics of my interlocutor, who can understand those elements. And it could be even that you don't know for sure if that is which language it is. But most of the time I know, and most of the time it is mainly speaking in one language, most of the time. Like now I'm speaking English. If I speak Basque to you, you will not understand. I like an analogy that Jim Cummins explains in the Encyclopedia of Language and Education, where he says that it is similar to colors. And I think it's true. Most of the time, I mean, I know what is blue, red, yellow, but it is true that it is a continuum and not absolute categories that we can have in closed boxes. So sometimes I can discuss, is this green or blue, even if most of the time I function in a way that I'm talking about different colors. Well, what has happened with languages is that the boundaries have been very hard, the boundaries between languages. And the idea is that they are softer than what, according to traditional pedagogies, have considered. And, or in the words of Jim Cummins, it could be fluid, socially, and cognitively. But there are soft boundaries, and we have to use this opportunity. And we have to use this opportunity to develop language awareness, to use the knowledge of different languages just to be more efficient when teaching languages and teaching language culture. Another point I would like to make is that, of course, there are different ways to understand translanguaging. And translanguaging is an umbrella term nowadays. And the way I can say I position myself is closer to the origin of translanguaging in the European context in Wales, where Williams explains, Ken Williams, as the idea, the aim is to strengthen and use both languages, Welsh and English, in a high level in order to develop balanced and confident bilingual pupils. He's talking about, and he says, developing academic skills and also about using both languages in the same session. The important thing about this is the idea that translanguaging, that this is pedagogical translanguaging, a term that Jim Cummins has also used. And even if there are different definitions, and we define it as the plan by the teacher inside the classroom and can refer to the use of different languages for input and output, as it was the case in Wales, but also to other planned strategies based in the use of a student's resources from the whole linguistic repertoire. What is important in these definitions is that it is planned and it is about using resources from the whole linguistic repertoire. We have expanded the term or the idea, the original concept of translanguaging coming from Wales, and it's not only, for us, it's not only input and output, but a lot more, and it is related to not only, to different levels, to discourse, pragmatics, cognates, morphology, and we also use it going beyond 2 languages, with 3 or more languages. The characteristics, one of the main characteristics of translanguaging in this context, in the European context, is that we aim at multilingualism in different languages. It's not only a transition to getting then a good grade in an English exam or going to university in English. We also have university not only in English, but also in other languages, including minority languages. Another point that I find interesting is the idea of what is weak and what is strong with translanguaging. It has been defined a bit like weak and strong if you think it's only if languages exist or don't exist. But I would say that it is weaker or stronger depending on the intensity of what you do inside the classroom, from a perspective of pedagogical translanguaging. So if you are using several languages in the same session to develop metalinguistic awareness, it's stronger than if only one language is used in each class, even if there is some coordination between the teachers, or if we are talking about translanguaging shifts that we refer to as spontaneous translanguaging. So there are different degrees, and the more intervention and the more use, if there is more use of resources from the whole linguistic repertoire, it can be considered stronger. Regarding academic language, translanguaging can be one of the ways. There are several strategies to help students to, and using Angeline's words, to unpack academic language into everyday language.
1 minute remaining.
As well as to repack everyday language into academic language. And translanguaging can be one of the strategies to be used to develop academic language at school. So this is the basic idea, pedagogical translanguaging to develop languages at school.
Thank you very much. And our last panelist before Jim has the concluding remarks is Dirk Gorger. Please go ahead.
Okay. My video? Oh, I don't see myself. Yes. Okay. Thank you for having me here, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to give our view on translanguaging. I begin by sketching my background to give you some context. My perspective is that of a speaker of Frisian, a minority language in the Netherlands. Frisian has obtained some recognition, and Frisian is taught in schools on a modest scale. But Frisian is not accepted as equal to the state language Dutch or to other languages. My position is also colored by living and doing research in the Basque Country for more than 10 years now. In the Basque Country, Basque as a minority language has gone through a remarkable transformation, in particular as the language of education. In the 1980s, the situation of Frisian and Basque was comparable. Both had a minor presence in the schools. In 1980, Frisian became an obligatory subject for 1 hour per week in all primary schools. That seemed like an important step forward at the time, but the situation for Frisian has not changed that much in the 40 years afterwards. The exception is the schools that are designated as trilingual schools, where Frisian, Dutch and English are all 3 taught as a medium of instruction. This has been seen as a positive development, even though the emphasis remains with Dutch. The minority language Frisian, and thus its speakers, the language is still often regarded as a second-rate language. Even if half of the population of the province speaks Frisian, its use in various domains and as a written language is rather limited. This is a position in education and in society that Frisian shares with several other regional minority languages in Europe or also elsewhere. In contrast, in the Basque Country, the past 40 years has shown an enormous change in the use and the teaching of Basque in education. Today, it is the dominant language in the whole education system. Around 90% of all young children that enroll in education choose the model where Basque is the main language of instruction and where Spanish and English are only taught as a subject. Students can, and they do, choose to have their whole school career through the minority language, including secondary and university education. And today this happens on a large scale. It includes students who have Basque as their home language, the first language, but also students who have Spanish as the first language or other first languages. At the University of the Basque Country, where I work now, about half of all subjects in any field of science is taught through the medium of Basque. So, in primary and secondary education, Basque is the predominant language of instruction today, and at university it reaches about 50%. Still, Basque has to be seen as an endangered language because in society at large, in most sectors outside education, Basque is a minority language and Spanish is the dominant language in society. Students who have Basque as their first language are expected to develop academic language and literary skills in the minority language, as well as in Spanish, the majority language, and to some degree also in English. So the aim of the education system is trilingualism or multilingualism for all students. Spontaneous translanguaging, the moving back and forth between Basque and Spanish, is common among the students in the Basque Country, especially for those whose first language is Basque. And the challenge here is not so much to legitimize spontaneous translanguaging and allow them to use both languages, but the challenge is to stop these bilingual students from becoming monolingual Spanish speakers because they do no longer use Basque. The context for Basque students is thus quite different from that of, for example, Latinx students in the United States, where spontaneous translanguaging can empower the minority language students. In the case of Basque and other minority languages such as Frisian or Welsh, spontaneous translanguaging goes usually from the majority to the minority, in the sense that the students tend to translanguage when they speak the minority language, but not so much when they speak the majority language. And the power inequality between the minority and majority languages leads to concerns that if translanguaging is encouraged, it will reinforce the majority language at the expense of the minority language. In our work, we distinguish between spontaneous translanguaging on the one hand and pedagogical translanguaging as the planned, designed application of using, practicing, and moving between the languages in an education context. This is what Cenoz had just explained and also what Jim Cummins mentioned. So how can we deal with this pedagogical translanguaging in this context of Basque, Spanish, and English? And that is what our research is about, and we think that our results can have applications not only in our own context, but also for Frisian, other minority languages in Europe, and even elsewhere. So students with Spanish and Basque as their first language, or other languages, are usually in the same class. However, students with the majority language as the first languages are often exposed only to the minority language at school, and they use the majority language extensively, also at school and elsewhere. And in this context, the question is not whether students are encouraged to translanguage, but whether they use the majority language instead of the minority language. The concern about the minority language in relation to pedagogical translanguaging shows the need to consider the context and the need to develop tailor-made programs to ensure that the use and development of the minority language takes place. And therefore, we have proposed a set of guiding principles for what we call sustainable translanguaging for regional minority languages such as Basque and Frisian. And the first of those principles is a concept that has also been disputed but not been mentioned today, but is the design of functional breathing spaces for using the minority language. And this concept of breathing space refers to designated safe spaces where they are physical, not for the minority language, and where they can be used freely and without threat to the majority language. It's, the need for larger, smaller breathing space depends on the specific context, because the context matters, of course. And this need for deliberately designed spaces where only the minority language is used has also been highlighted in different other contexts by different other authors, among others Jim Cummins, Ofelia Garcia, and Angel Lin, who mentioned it as designed spaces in this case. So even though this principle of breathing space for minority languages may seem similar to practice of language isolation, it is different. Because school children will have these breathing spaces in combination with other practices, other principles that are also based on pedagogical translanguaging. And Yasona has mentioned some of those. And there is a need to create these, to help these minority languages through translanguaging, to create metalinguistic awareness, to create critical knowledge about languages, and to link spontaneous and pedagogical translanguaging so that that can take place. Thank you. Dank u wel. Eskirikasko.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. I feel like I have trapped you in a marathon here, and I really appreciate how well you performed with the timing. Without further ado, I would like to invite Jim Cummins, who will have 10 minutes to offer a concluding remark, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for questions with the audience right after. Jim, you have the screen.
Okay, let's see. Can you see me okay? Because I can't see myself.
Yes. Okay.
So first of all, let me just thank all of the panelists for the insightful comments that they've made and the different perspectives that have been put forward in terms of the issue of translanguaging and its status in different contexts. My head is buzzing with a lot of different ideas and thoughts, none of which are at this point particularly coherent. But I'll try to comment on a number of the things that came up. First, Angel talked about the desirability of having a plurality or plural orientation to theory generation. And I think that's a really useful and productive perspective to bring to these things, because theories come from different places, different perspectives. And when we look at things only from one perspective, we have a limited view. And so I think the different perspectives in relation to translanguaging that we've heard can ideally fertilize each other and help to lead the field forward. In relation to that, let me just pick up on some of the things that Dirk mentioned in terms of the need to create and maintain a breathing space for the threatened minority languages. And this is a perspective that, as many of you know, has been highlighted also amongst researchers working in French immersion contexts in Canada, where they will endorse the desirability of bringing French and English into productive contact with each other, but at the same time insist that there needs to be a protective stance around the focus on French so that it doesn't get swamped by the dominant language English. And I think these are important perspectives, and there have been some very inspired and imaginative ways in which researchers in the Montreal area have brought the two languages into productive contact. So that I think I totally agree with the perspective that Dirk put forward, and the need to be somewhat cautious in relation to endorsement of translanguaging, and we need to ensure that it gets considered in a contextual way where a variety of other perspectives get taken in. Yasone mentioned the ways in which researchers and educators in the Basque Country have gone beyond the Welsh initial notions of translanguaging and have focused on translanguaging as a way of enhancing the awareness of language that students are developing when Basque, Spanish, and English are all in the mix. And I think a lot of the experience and the instructional initiatives that have taken place in that context are extremely useful. I'll talk a little bit about what Kate mentioned, and the the experiences that she talked about in relation to the pedagogical practice of Miss Winter, I think are exactly the kinds of things that should be happening in every class, and they're not. We should be connecting instruction to students' lives. We should be validating the varieties of language that they're bringing into the classroom and helping them to sustain development in those languages. We should have a focus on decolonizing the curriculum, and that is needed in many, many contexts. One of the main ones here in Canada being the education of Indigenous students. So that the kinds of direct pedagogical directions that Kate has talked about in her presentation, and that she and colleagues have elaborated in terms of the Translanguaging project that is taking place at CUNY, are totally valid, totally useful, and they're exactly the kinds of things that I've tried to endorse for many, many years. So when Kate says that she sees a difference in the pedagogical implications of unitary translanguaging theory versus cross-linguistic translanguaging theory, I'd invite her to look at some of the work that has been done that is not dependent on unitary translanguaging theory. For example, the work that predated the notion of translanguaging that was carried out in the International High School in New York City is exemplary in terms of how a high school can mobilize students' languages and build in those languages to develop strong academic English skills. And as Kate pointed out with Miss Winter's class, when we employ these pedagogical strategies, whether we want to put them under a UTT or a CTT umbrella, students' development of language and literacy skills in the dominant language increases dramatically. And the experience of academic success among students in the International High School network illustrates that. When we, let me move to Nelson's points, where he has argued that the notion of academic language is rooted in the culture of poverty that was a dominant discourse in the 1960s, and goes back even further, and the same kinds of sentiments go back even further to the era of eugenics. I see this as somewhat of a deflection and a distraction. The reality is that in schools, teachers are tasked with the challenge of helping to develop all students' knowledge of literacy skills in their ideally in their first language as well as in English, and we have the question of how we do this. The characteristics of academic language that Lily Wong Fillmore talked about and that I quoted in my presentation are there. Whether we dismiss those as being kind of objective, discrete entities that have no real status, or whether we see them as the realities of schools for students is a choice. The teachers that I've worked with and the work that I've done has focused on helping students to develop strong language and literacy skills, ideally in both English and their home languages, through critical language awareness work, through critical exploration of content. So all of the kinds of things that Kate talked about as being characteristic of UTT, but possibly not characteristic of cross-linguistic translanguaging theory, I would challenge, because these pedagogical strategies have been implemented in a broad translanguaging orientation, where we pick up on the language skills that students are bringing into the school. We use these as a foundation for expanding those skills. We connect instruction to students' lives. We have students carry out inquiry into all kinds of social and experiential things that concern their present and their futures. And there is absolutely no difference in the pedagogical implications of UTT and CTT in relation to this decolonizing work and this challenging of societal power relations. And this has been elaborated at length in work that I've tried to do. So Let me just thank again all the panelists, and I'm sure we'll continue this discussion in various forums. And thank you again, Nikolai and your colleagues, for setting up this very productive exchange.
Thank you, Jim, and thanks again to all the panelists. And once again, it really felt like a marathon, but it was really useful to hear this plurality of perspectives. I think we're ready to open up the Q&A with a few questions for Jim, of course, but also for all our panelists. I will try to read some questions out for Jim, and Marie-Paul and Catherine will also be assisting in sometimes typing answers in the chat. So we'll try to do this as efficiently and as quickly as possible. I will start with a question for, is the word of Western dominated knowledge much too blurry? How to define it? I'm not sure if we should direct this question to Jim.
Basically, we're talking about curriculum in schools, and the notion of Western dominated knowledge is one that obviously I think needs to be challenged. And what is happening in schools that are doing or implementing the kind of pedagogy that they should be implementing is that they are broadening the curriculum beyond what may be written in what comes down from state departments or departments of education. They're choosing novels and textbooks that connect up with students' lives and that challenge the exclusion of marginalized communities from schools and other institutions. So I think schools need to challenge Western dominated knowledge if they're going to challenge coercive relations of power and promote collaborative relations of power.
Thank you. I see that there is one more question that is, I think, specifically directed to Jim. It's from Michel Candelier. Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. Just to clarify for the European audience, what differences do you see between teaching for linguistic transfer and the approaches that have developed since the 1980s in Europe, usually called integrated language learning and intercomprehension?
Okay, the work that Michel and his colleagues have done over many, many years in the European context in terms of focusing on building up students' awareness of language, focusing on bringing languages into productive contact with each other is really exemplary. And I see that as being one major focus of a critical language awareness orientation within schools. I think in some respects, the work that has been done can be expanded beyond its initial focus which was on language awareness rather than awareness of how, or critical interrogation of how language is used in society and how language is used to exclude and often also to include. So I think, again, the work that's been done in Europe is something that educators and researchers, such as most of us here, should become much more aware of.
Thank you very much. I want to invite the audience also, if you have specific questions for the panelists, don't hesitate to identify them by name in the questions that you're typing in the chat. And I'm waiting here for more questions. Maybe because Angel Lynn didn't have a chance to speak so far, she only had sent an video recording. Angel, do you have a quick comment? I'll give you a minute to.
Yeah, my quick comment is, yeah, I think plurality of voices is always to be valued. And I stick to my point that all different theories are just stories, theoretical narratives. Of course, it's not that any theory goes, and it has to be attuned to empirical observations. And I do see utility in a whole spectrum of theoretical perspectives, depending on your context. And but I do want to say that there is utility in holding a dynamic view of languaging, focusing on first order
moment-to-moment communicating processes. So anyway, that's my two
Thank
cents.
you. Thank you, Angel. And I do want to mention that I know, unfortunately, Nelson Flores has very limited time and he will have to leave very shortly. So if anyone has questions specifically for him, he will be leaving in the next minute or two. So if you're a fast typer, go ahead. I see a response to Jim in face of... Actually, I'm going to read another question that addresses also to other panelists so that we can involve them. Could the panelists speak more about the issue on bounded versus dynamic views, which seem to be embedded in the current debate?
Okay, can I jump in? I feel like I've been drawing on the J. Lemke and Paul Thibault's work. And Paul Thibault differentiates between first order theoretical descriptions of what's happening in the dynamic moment-to-moment split-second kind of languaging behavior or processes. And then second order, third order descriptions of the linguistic systems, the grammars. So it cannot be dealt with in 1 minute in this panel, but I can send you the readings. You need to invest time in understanding bounded view, dynamic view. It's a philosophical, it is science, it is linguistic science. So that's my short answer to your complex question.
Thank you very much, Angel. A question to any speaker. To what extent do UTT conceptualizations apply internationally away from their home territory of language minority contexts with its specific colonial and racialized narratives in English dominant settings in the United States? Could it be that this particular viewpoint can be one of a number of approaches?
Well, I could,
any takers?
Yeah, I could say something about that. It is not the same context. I think that context is very important. And I think that the specific context of the US is quite different from other contexts. And I can understand very well the development of translanguaging in the US in a certain direction. But of course, I mean, it is different when you are, I think it's quite different in different contexts. That's why we say, and I think that Dirk Gorger said, it has to be tailor-made for each context. And I think that that is important, that it cannot be that the way it's understood in one context is just the only possible way to understand translanguaging.
Thank you very much. I will read one quick question for Nelson, even though I don't know if he's still here or he may have left, and I don't know if you'll have time to answer it. It's a question that says, yes, can Nelson respond to the idea that his comments deflected or distracted from the debate? Again, I don't see if Nelson is still here, and that may be a question that he may not be able to answer. Unfortunately, he has left. There's also a question for Jim. In face of Flores and Seltzer's responses and classroom experiences, what evidence would be sufficient for you in affirming a UTT?
The UTT, the defining characteristic of UTT that leads UTT theorists to reject notions like additive bilingualism, teaching for transfer, etc., is the notion that languages do not have cognitive reality. Languages do not exist in our mental grammar. We do not speak languages. And that is an assertion, a claim that can be looked at empirically. And I just gave a fraction of the some of the empirical data that could be brought in to look at that. And the data from aphasia patients that I mentioned, I think creates some challenges for the notion that languages have no linguistic reality in our brains. And all of the other issues that I've talked about in relation to the rejection by UTT theorists of notions like common underlying proficiency, the rejection of teaching academic language, we're seeing that as an oppressive force. All of those things come from that core characteristic of UTT, that languages do not exist in our brains. And so any theoretical construct that identifies language as having reality in our brains is automatically monoglossic and static, and by virtue of being monoglossic, it's oppressive.
Thank you, Jim. I have a question received here in the chat, which I will address to Kate Seltzer and maybe then Dirk Gorger. Where is translanguaging going? Can anyone share insights that might have on its future development, please? So this question, please, Kate first and then Dirk.
Thanks so much for the question. You know, I think because translanguaging can be taken up and has been taken up in so many ways, its directions are very fluid. I've seen people taking it up in lots of different ways. In my own work and in the work of some scholars that I know, there's a lot of talk, you know, and I agree that you have to think about context when you think about translanguaging. So obviously I speak from the context of the US, but I think that there is a lot of overlap and interesting ways of explicitly uniting an anti-racist stance with translanguaging and thinking about the disruption of racial-linguistic ideologies in language teaching. You know, that was something I was trying to get at in my talk and in my work with teachers. You know, Jim, I heard you say, you know, disagreeing with my idea that there was a difference in the pedagogical implications of the two theories. And the thing I think is different is this idea of explicitly challenging notions of academic language, of native speakers, of some of these concepts alongside students. And I think that's something that translanguaging can enable us to do. And it's certainly a direction I would like to see translanguaging take, you know, in work with teachers, is how to really get them to start thinking about what does it mean to destabilize these deficit framings alongside students? Because so many teachers in the US differ in their backgrounds from the students that they teach. So, you know, that's a direction I would like to see translanguaging go.
Thank you, Kate. And Dirk?
Well, it's interesting if you look at the history of the term translanguaging, that it originated in Wales, then it crossed the ocean, so it took the direction of going to the United States, where it developed its own, and then it came back to Europe. It became very popular, for instance, in the Scandinavian countries, especially in Sweden, and it had been implemented in different ways. And I think that's important because, as I explained, I speak from the position of a minority language speaker, and how we have tried to implement ideas about translanguaging. And one of the things that I remember from our first project a few years ago with teachers that were very hesitant about translanguaging, especially the idea that in the Basque classroom you could use Spanish at the same time to increase language awareness, to increase metalinguistic awareness. How can you use these languages side by side while you're always trying to defend Basque against Spanish? And what we made clear with that, because we used also English at the same time, was that the languages have the same prestige, that they are on the same level. Because until now, the discourse about Basque has always been, it's a minority language that we have to defend. But the moment you put it in a translanguaging context, in a pedagogical translanguaging environment, you put these languages at the same level, so to speak. You give them the same status, the same prestige, and you use them in the same way, which kind of disrupts this whole discourse about being the poor minority language that has been to be defended. No, it is a language just as much as Spanish or English, and it can influence in different directions. And that's a direction, if you talk about the future of translanguaging, well, I find it very hard to predict the weather tomorrow, so I don't know what the future will be. But translanguaging as it is going now will catch on, it's clear. And it is also clear that teachers can be convinced if they use it in the right way, if they use it in a way that fits their own context. It's not even context like the Basque Country. The context is often even the village where the school is located. Take that into consideration. Take the classroom into consideration. How many different languages do you have in the classroom? All these factors have to be taken into consideration to develop your own plan, your own design of how to use elements from translanguaging practices. And then it is less important for that teacher at that very moment what the theories behind it are. It is how they implement at that very moment so that they can encourage their children in the classroom to use, in our case, 3 or 4 or 5 languages in trying to improve their language use, trying to develop the language use. That's what I want to say about it.
Thank you. The next question is for the person in the chair next to you, Dirk. It's a question for Yasone. Could Yasone speak some more about the differences between spontaneous and planned translanguaging, their effectiveness and strength pedagogically speaking?
Okay, we see spontaneous and planned translanguaging, pedagogical translanguaging, we see them as a continuum. Spontaneous translanguaging is what I do when I'm talking informally, and I use resources from my whole linguistic repertoire, texting quite often, or orally, okay? And that is something that is natural and that we do. Pedagogical translanguaging is planned and it has a pedagogical aim. So the way we do that at school, and when we implement that at the school, is that we have some pedagogical aims using resources. In our case, we use resources from Basque, Spanish, and English. And it can be, well, a context of a text, and then we work with vocabulary or discourse, but we look at what children know. Sometimes, I mean, not only the 3 languages in the curriculum, but also other languages they may speak at home, and that they have the opportunity to use the resources, the knowledge they already have about languages, developing language awareness and metalinguistic awareness. Now, it is a continuum. That means that, of course, we can be in a class and there is an activity of pedagogical translanguaging or not, and there is a translanguaging shift. That's a term that also Kate is using in this wonderful book about the pedagogical strategies in the classroom with Ofelia Garcia. So they can be a translanguaging shift. This translanguaging shift can have a pedagogical value. That's why we cannot put it as completely separate. The teacher can use that translanguaging shift, which is spontaneous in the class, with a pedagogical value and link it to something explaining, to raise some awareness, to raise cultural awareness, raise language awareness, or whatever. The same as with spontaneous translanguaging. Sometimes, I mean, it can have a pedagogical value, but also they can be, as part of pedagogical translanguaging, they can be also a shift all of a sudden. So you cannot have, I mean, you can see, like, it is a continuum, can be planned or not, but you cannot say completely, these are completely 2 different categories, completely separated. You can use a spontaneous translanguaging pedagogically also.
Thank you kindly. Next question, Angel Lynn, please, followed by Jim Cummins, if I may. Different theories develop in different contexts. How do we reconcile speaking across and from these distinct realities? Are there not commonalities across ideologies that are embedded in colonialism that are relevant to all the contexts from which we are speaking today?
Yes, quickly, of course. Theories have similarities and differences, and those are context dependent. So I'm not saying that the theories are apples and oranges and they can't talk to each other, otherwise we won't be here. And colonialism is still here, whether it is in the form of whatever form, in North American context, in Asian, European context. It's just up to researchers situated in different contexts to do the hard work. We cannot just import theories from Jim Cummins, from Angel Lin, from Yasonet, right? We can use their theories and then find out what is relevant, what is not relevant, what is context very specific to my context. So the hard work has to be done by situated researchers. But if you allow me to share very quickly, I've developed this for pedagogical planning, that we need to, whatever context, we need to have a space, we need to have a cycle where you can allow students to translanguage, I would say transfeature, and mixing so-called academic language with so-called everyday language. I would say everyday language features, mixing them with academic language features, and those boundaries are porous. And then you also have a space to artificially constrain in order to protect the space for minoritized languages or for the target languages or target features, patternings. And then you reiterate the cycle so that you don't set up a hierarchy. It's just scaffolding the target language. The target language is the end, and your home languages are just the scaffolding. In the end, you take away the scaffolding, you just need the target language. That's an implicit hierarchy set up in most of the classrooms with the best intentions, scaffolding. But we need to take away this idea that scaffolding should be taken away. It's not demolishing the hierarchy, which is implicitly set up even by the well-meaning teachers with, okay, I allow you to translanguage, use whatever you like, but in the end, you just need to pass the exam in the elite languages or genres or registers, whatever you call it. And I saw a question about assessment, and Saskia in York University, Sunny Lau in Bishop University, we have next month, exactly this time, with multilingual approaches to assessment, and Yasonet will be on our panel as well. Okay.
Thank you, Angel. Jim?
Okay, I agree with everything Angel said, and also the premise of the question that theories develop in particular contexts, and they need to be evaluated and addressed in relation to the questions that they were designed to answer. So in my presentation, I talked about how the notion of interdependence or common underlying proficiency came about. That came about with specific reference to the debates on bilingual education that were going on in the United States at that time, where subtractive orientations and oppressive exclusionary orientations towards students' home languages were the norm. And the common underlying proficiency was designed to show how you could have less instructional time through English and students end up doing better in English. So that was the context in which that came about. But one of the criticisms that's been made of that is that, well, you know, this is not very dynamic. It's just talking about two languages sort of coming together in that common underlying proficiency. And we know that the bilinguals and multilinguals cognitive network is much more complex than that and much more dynamic. Well, the common underlying proficiency wasn't addressed to looking at how the multilingual languages intersect. It wasn't a theory of cognitive and neurological processing. So it's got to be, but the issue is it compatible with that? And I've argued that it certainly is. But in terms of the influence of colonial perspectives, I would put those into a broader framework of looking at how power relations operate. And obviously, colonialism is one component of power relations. And colonial perspectives were very much in evidence in terms of the the suppression of community languages in many countries around the world. It's very much at play in the cultural genocide of Indigenous people in Canada and elsewhere. And so schools need to address those issues. And unless schools are actively addressing issues of power relations in the broader society and how they get reflected in schools in terms of identity negotiation, they're not doing their job. So power relations and their influence on identity negotiation is fundamental to everything that happens in school. So in terms of, going back to Kate's point about having students interrogate normalized notions of language and status of languages, of course schools need to be challenging hierarchies of language and every kind of hierarchies if we're going to create contexts of empowerment and academic advancements for students. So that is a core element of what I've called cross-linguistic translanguaging theory.
Thank you, Jim. And I think we are really quickly running out. We have run out of time. I do want to ask one question and direct it to Kate. Writers in translanguaging discuss how language assessment has remained stubbornly monoglossic in orientation, despite some strides in incorporating translanguaging in instruction. Can any speakers discuss ideas about incorporating multilingual approaches in assessment activities, formative and summative? Kate, you have that last one, and then I'll have to close the discussion. Others may feel free to use the chat and answer. So the panelists have the chat enabled so they can answer this question as well in writing if they can type fast. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I actually have an article that will be coming out with Laura Ascenzi Moreno, who is also based in the US and writes a lot about assessment, that actually talks about the racial-linguistic ideologies and coloniality embedded in assessment and what it would take for teachers on the ground to make what Laura calls responsive adaptations to their assessment practices that account for teachers, for students translanguaging. So keep an eye out for that. And in the Translanguaging Classroom book, when we talk about assessment, we talk about how important it is to really separate the ways that we're assessing, particularly emergent bilinguals in classrooms, in formative assessments, by measuring their general linguistic performances and their language-specific performances, assessing them on a task using all of their language resources, and also assessing them when they have to suppress some of those features and enact only those associated with a named language like English, or in a dual language program, say in English and Spanish. So I think the more that we can lean into looking at students' language performances through a translanguaging lens, we can think a little bit about how we can better understand what students know and what they can do by giving them opportunities to perform on a task using all of their language practices, but then also what they need to learn in a specific named language of the school. So I think that there are ways to do both those things, particularly in formative classroom assessments.
Thank you very much. We have run out of time, unfortunately. As we see, this discussion has been extremely productive. I want to thank our plenary speaker, Jim Cummins. I'd like to really thank also the panelists for their kind participation, their engagement, and their sharp minds.